Have you ever, like, stopped to think about vitamins? You know, we take them, we hear they're good for us, but why? Why do we actually need them?
It's a good question. They're these, well, relatively small organic compounds, but absolutely crucial. I mean, if you don't get enough, it can lead to some really serious diseases.
Right, and that's where organic chemistry comes in, isn't it?
Yeah.
Synthesis, actually building these things in the lab, has been huge for understanding them
Oh,
and even making them widely available.
absolutely. The story behind synthesizing certain vitamins, which maybe we can touch on, it's not just chemistry history, it's, well, a massive achievement for society, showed what organic synthesis could really do.
That actually tees us up perfectly. This deep dive is all about organic synthesis. You know, the art, the science of putting molecules together, building complex ones from simpler pieces.
Right.
And our goal today is basically to give you a solid method, a kind of step-by-step way to tackle synthesis problems. We'll start pretty simple, one-step stuff, and build up.
Think of it as a way to get up to speed on a really core skill in organic chem, especially for those of you who've already got the basics down.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in the real world, synthesis isn't always straightforward, right? Things go wrong.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, real lab work involves a lot of troubleshooting, thinking on your feet, worrying about costs, how pure your product is, all that stuff.
But for today, let's make a simplifying assumption. Let's assume all the reactions we've covered before, they just work reliably.
Which lets us focus purely on the strategy, the thinking behind it, which is honestly where a lot of the cleverness comes in.
Okay, so let's dig in. Foundational stuff first. One-step syntheses. For listeners familiar with the material, this is often like instinctual, right? Quick recall.
Yeah, you see the transformation, you know the reagent, like alkene to a dibromo alkane. You just add Br2, simple as that.
But, and this is key,
Oh, absolutely key. You have to know those reagents and reactions from earlier chapters cold. Like, really know them. If you can't nail a one-step transformation, multi-step problems, forget it.
they become impossible.
Pretty much. It's your absolute foundation, your toolbox.
So if maybe you're feeling a little shaky on some of that, substitution versus elimination, maybe alkane synthesis, halogenation, now's a good time for a quick mental refresh.
Definitely. Having those core reactions solid will pay off big time.
All right, let's move on. Let's talk about functional groups. Changing their identity, maybe moving them around in the molecule, but keeping the carbon backbone the same. This is where it gets more dynamic.
Yeah, and what's cool here is how often it takes, like, 2 steps to do something you can't do in one, moving a halogen, for example.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, a common way is elimination. First, use a base, make an alkane, then addition. But the trick is controlling where things happen, the regiochemistry.
Ah, right, like Zaitsev versus Hoffman elimination.
Exactly. Your choice of base matters there. And then for the addition, do you want Markovnikov or anti-Markovnikov? Using peroxides, for instance, guides that second step. It's about precision.
Okay, and what if it's an alcohol group, the LH? Similar idea.
Similar, yeah, but with a little prep step first. OH isn't a great leaving group by itself, so you often convert it to something better, like a tosylate. Then you do the elimination-addition sequence.
Still keeping that regiochemical control in mind.
Always. Same goes for moving a double bond, a pi bond. You might do an addition first, then an elimination to put the double bonds somewhere else. Again, your reagents dictate the outcome. Markovnikov, bond to Markovnikov, sites of Hoffman. You're guiding it.
It's not just moving groups, though, is it? It's sometimes changing the bonds themselves.
Yeah.
Single to double, double to triple.
Exactly. You can take an alkane, do radical bromination, then elimination. Boom, you've got an alkane. You've introduced reactivity.
Yeah.
Or alkene to alkane often involves adding bromine to get a dehalide, then double elimination.
So a problem could ask you to change the group and its location.
Right. Maybe you need to turn an internal alkene into a terminal alkyl halide. That might mean, say, anti-Markovnikov addition first, then maybe a Hoffman elimination to shift things to the end.
And there might be more than one way to do it.
Often, yes. Synthesis can be like solving a puzzle with multiple solutions. You're usually aiming for the most efficient route, fewest steps, but yeah, multiple paths can work.
Okay, let's shift gears again. What about changing the actual number of carbons?
Yeah.
Making the skeleton bigger or smaller?
Yeah, sculpting the skeleton itself. This is crucial. So if your target molecule has more carbons than what you started with, you obviously need a reaction that forms new carbon bonds.
And based on what we've covered so far?
There's really only one main player for that right now: alkylation of a terminal alkyne.
The alkynide ion.
Exactly. It acts as a nucleophile, attacks a primary alkyl halide, and you add carbons. Very powerful for building bigger molecules. Secondary halides don't usually work well there. Too much elimination.
Got it. And going the other way.
Yeah.
Making the molecule smaller, breaking CC bonds.
Right, bond cleavage. Again, for the reactions covered so far, the go-to is ozonolysis. Works on alkenes or alkynes. It basically just snips the pi bond, breaks the molecule into smaller pieces. Very useful, very precise.
So the absolute first thing you should do when looking at a synthesis problem.
Count the carbons. Starting material versus product immediately tells you if you need one of those reactions, the alkyne alkylation or the ozonolysis. It's a massive strategic clue right at the start.
Okay, so that leads nicely into the master plan, the strategy for tackling any synthesis problem. You're saying it boils down to just two key questions.
Pretty much. Two fundamental questions you ask yourself every single time. One, is the carbon skeleton changing? Are we adding or losing carbons?
Okay, and two.
Two, is the functional group changing? Either its identity, like alcohol becoming a halide, or its location, moving from one carbon to another, or both.
So how does asking those guide you? Let's say you need to do both add carbons and change a functional group.
Well, the answers tell you which types of reactions you need, and often the order. For instance, if you need to add carbons via alkyne alkylation, but your starting material isn't an alkene, well, you might need to make the alkene first, then do the alkylation, then maybe transform the functional group further. The questions set the roadmap.
It's a systematic approach.
It is. And, this kind of strategic chemical thinking, it connects to some amazing history like the discovery of vitamins. Long before chemists could synthesize them, people noticed connections between diet and disease. Scurvy, for example.
Ah, yeah, the sailors and limes. James Lind, right?
Yeah.
1747.
That's the one. He showed citrus fruits cured scurvy, even though no one knew what was in them, just that something vital was missing from the sailor's diet, hence limes.
And there were other clues, too.
Oh, yeah. Gell and Hopkins found rats needed more than just pure carbs, proteins, fats. They needed tiny amounts of something in milk, these growth factors.
And the beriberi story in Asia. With the rice?
Exactly. Christian Eichmann linked polished rice to paralysis in hens, while whole rice prevented it. The husk had something essential.
So people were piecing it together observationally.
Right. Until Casimir Funk, around 1912, actually isolated the compound from rice husks responsible for preventing beriberi. It had an amine group, so he called them vitamines, vital amines.
Even though not all of them turned out to be amines.
Nope, but the name stuck. These early discoveries were huge. They showed these small organic molecules were incredibly important. And once vitamin C was synthesized industrially, it created this huge hope, maybe we can make all these essential things in the lab.
But some were way, way harder challenges. Which brings us to more complex problems and needing a more advanced approach.
Exactly. For really tough syntheses, working forward step by step can get overwhelming. That's where retrosynthetic analysis comes in.
Okay, what's that?
Instead of starting with your starting material, you start with the final product you want to make. And you ask, what could I have made this from in the last step? You work backward.
Like solving the maze in reverse, you said.
Precisely. E.j.corey at Harvard really formalized this approach. Chemists even use a special arrow, looks like, which means can be made from. It visually represents thinking backward.
Okay, let's try an example. Like that alcohol to alkene conversion we mentioned. How would retrosynthesis work?
You'd start with the alkyne, ask, how do we make triple bonds? Well, often from a vicinal dihalide via double elimination. So alkyne vicinal dihalide.
Got it.
Then you look at the dihalide. How are these made? Usually by adding halogen, like Br2, across an alkene. So vicinal dihalide alkyne.
And finally, connect the alkene back to the starting alcohol.
Right. How do I make that specific alkene for my alcohol? Maybe convert the OH to a tosylate, then elimination. So alkene, alcohol via tosylate. You've worked backward to reveal the forward steps, alcohol, tosylate, alkene, aldehyde, alkene.
Oh, okay. It breaks down the complexity.
It's essential for really complex molecules. And the ultimate example, probably vitamin B12.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that earlier. What was so hard about it?
Everything. Ed Ricks isolated it in 1947. Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin figured out its structure using X-ray crystallography itself, a massive task. It's got this incredibly complex structure, a corin ring, cobalt in the middle, tons of chiral centers, just a beast.
So synthesizing it was.
Ambitious. Hugely ambitious. Two top chemists, Robert Woodward at Harvard and Albert Eschenmoser in Zurich, tackled it independently. They hit roadblocks, stuff no one expected.
Like what?
Well, Eschenmoser needed to join two big, complex pieces, but they were too sterically hindered, they just wouldn't connect. So he had to invent a completely new reaction, the sulfide contraction, just to solve that one problem. That's how challenging it was.
Wow. How long did it take?
The whole effort involved about 100 grad students, took over a decade. They finally finished in 1972.
Incredible.
It was a landmark. It basically proved chemists could, in principle, make anything, no matter how complex. It was a triumph of strategy, persistence, and sheer chemical creativity.
And it had ripple effects too, right?
Yeah, big time. Woodward's work on B12 led directly to the Woodward-Hoffman rules, explaining a whole class of reactions. That work won him a Nobel Prize later. So tackling these huge synthetic challenges pushes the whole field forward.
Okay, so we've talked complexity. Let's talk responsibility. Green chemistry. That seems increasingly important.
Oh, absolutely crucial. It's about designing chemical processes that reduce or eliminate the use and generation of hazardous substances. Basically, doing chemistry in a more environmentally friendly way.
What are some of the key ideas?
Well, several principles guide it. First, prevent waste. Better to not make waste than to clean it up later. Design reactions efficiently.
Makes sense.
Second, try to use less hazardous chemicals. If you can substitute a dangerous reagent for a safer one, do it. Third, safer solvents. Avoid nasty chlorinated solvents if possible. Use water or maybe ethanol or even no solvent if you can.
I've heard about atom economy. What's that?
Right. Maximize atom economy. That means designing reactions so that as many atoms as possible from your starting materials end up in your final product, rather than in waste byproducts.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about hydrating an alkene. Simple acid-catalyzed hydration incorporates the H and OH from water directly into the molecule. Very high atom economy. Compare that to, say, oxymercuration. Demercuration works well, but you end up with mercury waste. Poor atom economy.
Okay, I see. Other principles.
Yes. Use catalysts whenever possible. They're used in small amounts and aren't consumed, unlike stoichiometric reagents, so less waste. Aim for energy efficiency reactions at room temperature are better than ones needing lots of heat. And try to use renewable feedstocks, starting materials derived from plants or biomass instead of petroleum when feasible.
And it's not just good for the planet, right? It's often good for the bottom line, too.
Often, yeah. Less waste means lower disposal costs. Safer reagents mean less hazard management. Energy efficiency saves power costs. Green chemistry often makes economic sense, too. It's smart chemistry.
Is there a good real-world example of where these ideas, maybe combined with synthesis, made a big difference?
The Taxol story is a fantastic one. Taxol, or paclitaxel, is this amazing anti-cancer drug, initially found in the bark of the Pacific yew tree.
But there wasn't much of it.
Very little. The tree grows slowly, and you needed bark from several mature trees for just one patient's treatment course. Totally unsustainable.
So chemists had to synthesize it?
Well, people tried. Robert Holton and Casey Niccolo achieved incredible total syntheses, huge achievements confirming the structure, but way too long and complex for commercial production, like dozens and dozens of steps.
So how did they solve the supply problem?
The breakthrough came from finding a related compound, a precursor called 10-deacetylobacin 3rd, in the needles of the European yew tree, which is much more common.
Ah, and needles can be harvested without killing the tree.
Exactly. And crucially, this precursor could be converted into Taxol or similar effective drugs like Taxotere in just a few synthetic steps. Much more practical, sustainable.
So it was a combination of finding a natural source and then using smart synthesis to finish the job.
Precisely. It beautifully shows how natural product chemistry and synthetic chemistry work together to solve major medical problems. A real green chemistry success, too, in a way.
Okay, we've covered a ton. Synthesis strategy, retrosynthesis, green chemistry.
Yeah.
For someone wanting to really get good at this, what are some practical tips?
Right, how to get proficient. First, I'd say organize your reaction knowledge. Think of it like having two mental toolboxes.
Okay.
One is small but powerful, your CC bond-forming and breaking reactions. Right now, that's basically alkane alkylation and ozonolysis. Know these inside out. They change the skeleton.
And the second toolbox.
That's your bigger list.
Yeah.
All the functional group transformations. Alcohol to halide, alkane to alcohol, elimination, addition, all that stuff. Keeping them mentally separate helps you strategize, am I changing the skeleton or just rearranging the functional groups?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What else?
Practice by making up your own problems. Seriously. Start with something simple, like butane. do a reaction, say bromination. Then do another, maybe elimination. Keep going for a few steps. Then erase everything in the middle. Just leave the start and the end.
And try to solve it back.
Yeah. It forces you to think about reaction sequences, how things connect. You start seeing patterns you might miss just doing textbook problems. It builds intuition.
Good tip. Anything else?
Yeah. Remember that there's often more than one right answer in synthesis. Don't get fixated on finding the single correct pathway.
Because multiple routes might work.
Exactly. One route might be shorter, another might give better yield, another might avoid a tricky separation. The goal is usually efficiency, but appreciate that different valid strategies exist, like anti-Markovnikov hydration. There are a couple of ways to do that. Explore them.
So be creative, be systematic, and know your reactions.
That's pretty much it. Organic synthesis is this constantly evolving puzzle, part logic, part creativity. You're always trying to find the best way to build these amazing molecular structures. It really is like art in a way.
Well, that feels like a good place to wrap up our deep dive into organic synthesis. We went from single steps all the way to complex strategies like retrosynthesis. Hopefully this gives you a solid framework, a bit of a shortcut, really, to tackling these kinds of problems.
Yeah, it's a core skill, and hopefully this discussion helps you feel more comfortable navigating it.
Thank you, as always, for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring the hidden depths of chemistry.